I would like to welcome you to this noon forum presented by the Associated Student Speakers Program. Today, we will present a debate on the following, resolved: the conflicts in communism diminish the communist threat. The Speakers Program is pleased to welcome the participants: Dr. Fred Schwarz, President of the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade. Dr. Schwarz came to the United States in 1950, where he received a medical degree in Australia. He spoke between 1950 and 1953 here, and in 1953 established his roots with the Crusade. Dr. Howard Swear is a political science professor here at UCLA, and he is currently serving as chairman of the Chancellor's Committee on International and Comparative Studies, established in 1965. Dr. Schwarz will be taking the negative, Dr. Swear taking the affirmative. Each speaker will make an opening statement of 12 minutes, will respond with an 8-minute statement, and a 4-minute concluding statement. At that time, we will take questions from the floor. Although it is somewhat orthodox in procedure, Dr. Schwarz will speak first on the negative. The question: resolved, the conflicts in communism diminish the communist threat. Dr. Schwarz.
Thank you. Mr. Levine, Dr. Swearer, and students, I appreciate this opportunity of having what I hope will be a rational and informative discussion on a very important subject. But long since I've discovered that it's easy to have a very fierce argument and become deeply involved in the argument and find at the conclusion that the individual with whom you were arguing was talking about something entirely different from what you were talking about, even though the same words were used. The title of today's debate seems very straightforward, even though we are taking the slightly unorthodox approach of the negative speaking first. And yet it would be quite possible for us to have this debate and not even agree concerning the words we were using, and so it would be quite pointless. So I'd like to try to define what I mean by the terms in the subject. The subject is: the current conflicts of communism diminish the communist threat. The current conflicts of communism diminish the communist threat. The communist threat I would define as the involuntary servitude of the American people under a communist dictatorship, and all the processes that would minister to that end. This is usually summed up by the statement that the communist objective is world communist conquest. And I accept the thesis that the communists not only believe that inevitably communism will prevail over the entire world, but that they have a program in being in tune with that conviction. So the discussion is: do the current conflicts of communism render more or less likely the consummation of this program for the establishment of communist dictatorship within the United States? When I'm referring to the current conflicts of communism, basically we're referring to the Sino-Soviet split, as it's so often called, or the conflict between the Communists of Russia and the Communists of China, though this is only one of the many conflicts which presently exist within the communist world. For example, it's been well known for some time that the Yugoslavian communists have not had a totally identical position and program with the Russian communists throughout the world. But the major internal communist conflict is the one between Russia and the Soviet Union, and most of my attention will be directed to that. I'd also like to say this. The subject is, the current conflicts of communism diminish the communist threat. As I take the negative, I don't feel it necessary to prove that the current conflicts of communism increase the communist threat. I don't feel that I must do that to sustain my point. If I can establish that there is a reasonable doubt that the overall total program of communism is handicapped by the internal conflicts, I think I would have established the negative. If I can show that there is a possibility that the internal conflicts of communism can be exploited by the communists to advance their cause, I also think I will have sustained the negative. I don't think it imperative to prove that the conflicts of communism increase the communist threat. I'd like to outline what I consider to be the communist formula for the conquest of the United States. Then I would like to discuss the conflict between the Soviet Union and Communist China, and then I'd like to consider whether this conflict diminishes or increases the chance of success of the formula. I would suggest the communist formula for the conquest of the United States is external encirclement plus internal demoralization leads to progressive surrender. The communists do not conceive of the establishment of communism within the United States by a majority of American people desiring it and voting for it at the ballot box. They do not conceive of the establishment of communism within the United States by defeat in a thermonuclear war. The Russian communists, I repeat, the Russian communists do not conceive of the establishment of communist dictatorship within the United States by an internal violent revolution, though the Chinese communists do adhere to that classical Marxist approach. That is one of the points of grave divergence between the Russian and Chinese communists. The basic strategy is external encirclement plus internal demoralization equals or leads to progressive surrender. This strategy was summed up rather well by the defense minister of Communist China, Lin Piao, when he wrote his article on People's War some 12 or 18 months ago. He outlined Mao Zedong's strategy of people's warfare, in which he stated that you began out in the rural areas, away from the urban centers. You established your revolutionary base, and you expanded your revolutionary base. While this was taking place, you did not make frontal attacks on the cities. Rather, you infiltrated and demoralized within the cities. And at a certain point in this process, the cities were encircled, cut off from their sources of supply, and simply surrendered. Lin Piao then went on to say, in the international scene, North America and Western Europe could be classified as the cities of the world, whereas Asia, Africa, and Latin America could be classified as the rural areas. for certain reasons, a proletarian revolution in Western Europe and the Soviet Union has been temporarily halted, whereas the people's revolutions in Asia, Africa and Latin America are progressing most favorably. And he proceeded to say that the conquest of the United States and Western Europe would be the result of the encirclement from Asia, Africa and Latin America by the conquest of these areas by People's War. That was a specific statement by the Defense Minister of Communist China. But I would suggest that the Russian-Soviet program of coexistence is simply a somewhat more sophisticated program for the same thing. External encirclement plus internal demoralization leading to progressive surrender. It's noteworthy, for example, that 75% of the major weaponry in Vietnam is provided by the Soviet Union, not Communist China. It's noteworthy, for example, that Fidel Castro, who is venomously against the United States and what he calls United States imperialism, is associated more with the Soviet Union than with Communist China. It's noteworthy that the subversion of Latin America and the people's warfare is being financed more by the Soviet Union in Latin America than it is by Communist China. So any objective observer must reach the conclusion that whatever peaceful coexistence means to the Russians, it does not mean the cessation of their financing and arming people's revolution down in Latin America. So, to sum up, the big argument between the Russian and Chinese communists does not concern Asia, Africa or Latin America. Basically, it concerns Western Europe, where the Chinese communists want the communists of Italy and France, for example, to stage violent revolutions and communize the countries. Whereas the Russian communists want the communists of Italy and France to become very benign, to associate with the socialist parties and the other left parties to form a united front, to win election to parliamentary power as a united front and neutralize these countries. So the Soviet objective is not the present communization of France and Italy, but their neutralization, whereupon they believe they'd make a deal with Western Europe, that the Europe would be neutralized to the Atlantic coast, America would be isolated, and the demoralizing processes associated with the external pressures would bring about the concessions which in totality would equate surrender. Now, does the Sino-Soviet split help or hinder this program? In some ways, it helps it. Let me give you one illustration. In 1958, the conflict between Russia and China began. Russia was supplying China with oil. The supply of oil to China ceased. China turned then to France and contracted for 3 million tons of Sahara oil a year, and I think in some degree that accounts for the change in the French attitude. Russia now had the oil which previously had gone to China for infiltration of the Western markets. She dumped it down in Italy for 2/3 of the market price and infiltrated and influenced and moved both Italy and France towards the left. And in this specific instance, I believe the conflict has favored the Soviet Union program of conquest. So I would say this: the conflicts certainly don't diminish the communist threat. They provide an opportunity, and if we're not aware and take advantage of it, they can increase the danger of communist conquest.
Dr. Swearek?
You'll excuse me, I prefer to walk around a bit when I talk. Since the debate format is a bit unusual, because the negative went first, I would like to be a bit unorthodox myself and to talk about two of the dangers, even though I'm on the positive side. Two of the dangers, I think, of the split. Two of the dangers which Dr. Schwarz did not refer to, but I think he might have made a very strong case had he referred to them. In the first place, I think one of the main dangers of the splits within the communist world is that it's now a much less predictable world than it was 15 years ago under Stalin. When you had a single monolithic, more or less monolithic, it was not as monolithic then as we thought it was, but more or less monolithic communist movement, it was much more easy for American foreign policymakers to make decisions, better able to gauge reactions on the part of the Soviet leadership. It was even possible to hold the Soviets responsible for Chinese actions, as we attempted to do in 1958 at the time of the Quemoy and Matsu crisis. This is no longer possible. It's much more difficult for us to predict responses. It's much more difficult for Soviet and Chinese leadership also to make decisions in foreign policy. And when you have more variables involved, less predictability, I think it's a more dangerous world, perhaps. Secondly, while, as I'll argue in a moment, I think the polycentric communist movement is less of a danger today than the communist movement, say, before 1956. Nevertheless, to the extent that communist movements and communist parties in different countries can adapt themselves to the local conditions and therefore become truly indigenous communist parties and be responsive to the needs and the demands and the interests of the indigenous populations, then they're very likely to be more successful. The Italian Communist Party may very well be a case in point, as Dr. Schwarz pointed out. Before, when the communist parties were obviously strictly controlled from Moscow, and this was particularly true, say, of the American Communist Party, and the doctrines and the programs they put forward oftentimes had very little relationship to the countries in which they operated, then by and large they were not successful. Let me turn then to the positive side of the argument. But first of all, I'd like to say a few words about how you view the communist movement, because I would, from the outset, reject Dr. Schwarz's use of the term the communist or the communist program. I think you must talk about Russian communists, Cuban communists, Chinese communists, Yugoslav communists, or what have you. I think the time of talking about the worldwide communist movement has passed, if indeed it was ever appropriate to talk about the worldwide communist movement. Moreover, I'm struck not only in Dr. Schwarz's comments, but also in some of the writings which I had a chance to peruse over the weekend, with a more or less narrow-gauge, single-minded view of the world communist movement. There's I think, a tendency on the part of Dr. Schwarz to see the communist movement as a very clever, almost omniscient, almost omnipotent conspiracy, which is operating within the United States and around the world. That this conspiracy is ideologically motivated, and that to understand this conspiracy, it's primarily necessary simply to understand the philosophy of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and Stalin. In fact, I would like to quote a short sentence from the first page of his book, "You Can Trust the Communists to Do Exactly as They Say." It says, "Once we accept the fact that communists are communists and understand the laws of their thought and conduct, all the mystery disappears, and we are confronted with a movement which is frightening in its superb organization, strategic mobility, and universal program, but which is perfectly understandable and almost mathematically predictable." Well, I would suggest that it's not that mathematically predictable, that it's not that superb an organization, or does not have that much strategic mobility. I think there is a tendency on the part of Dr. Schwarz to overlook some of the economic, social, and political factors which shape policymaking in the communist world much as it does in the United States or Western Europe. There is a tendency on his part to suggest, for example, that splits in the communist world may indeed strengthen the communist movement rather than to weaken the communist movement. Talking about the succession struggle after Stalin's death in '53 in the Soviet Union, he wrote, "Periodically we see evidence of what appears to be a fundamental division within the Communist Party. Leading communists are suddenly hurled from their seats of power. They plunge into the abyss of shame, disgrace, and frequently of death. When we hear of quarreling in the top ranks of communism, we smile happily and wait for the split to come and for communism to disintegrate. But our hopes are always doomed to disappointment because we do not understand that quarreling at the top level of communism, leading to the disgrace of leading communists, is not an evidence of division but a proof of unity. It is not a manifestation of weakness, it is a sign of strength." This is the kind of dialectic reasoning which is very hard for me to understand. There is no doubt in my mind that the divisions in the Soviet Union after Stalin's death were indeed debilitating for a considerable period of time, and there's no doubt in my mind that the Sino-Soviet split is a true and genuine split. based upon geographic, economic, social, and political factors, and just a pure power drive between the Chinese and the Russians, and that the split certainly is not a sign of unity. Now, if you do not understand that the communists, the different communists in the world, are a very complex phenomenon, and that you cannot prescribe simple nostrums to combat what you think the dangers are involved, then I think we're in danger of prescribing nostrums which may be not only misleading, but indeed quite dangerous. First of all, let's take the Sino-Soviet split. The Sino-Soviet split is not merely an ideological split. It's a split based upon power drives for control of communist parties in different countries. I think largely it results from nationalistic impulses, which we see particularly manifested in Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong certainly is a Marxist-Leninist, but I would say viscerally he's above all a Chinese nationalist, and secondly, cerebrally perhaps, he's a Marxist-Leninist. There is certainly a strong sense of pride in Mao Zedong and a dislike of the high-handed way in which the Soviets have treated the Chinese. Professor Schwarz referred to the Lin Biao statement of some months ago when he said that the countryside, the rural areas would surround the cities of the world. Lin Biao was referring not only to Western Europe and the United States, he was also referring to European Russia. And this has been made plain again and again. The Chinese communists at the time of the projected Solidarity Conference, the Afro-Asian Solidarity Conference, attempted to organize a bloc not only against Western imperialism, but against Soviet revisionism. They did not succeed, I would point out. The whole polycentric movement in the communist world, I'll use the word for shorthand means, is a sure sign of the influence of nationalism, which I think dilutes greatly Marxism-Leninism. In sum, in order to understand communism and whatever threat communism poses to the United States, one must look not only at the ideology, but at the power factors involved, the politics, the social and economic factors. Now, I think that the Sino-Soviet split and other splits have lessened the threat. In the first place, if you take a look at the great cultural proletarian revolution within China, which after all is a split or is dissent within communism, it certainly has lowered the prestige of the Chinese communists around the world. Certainly the Japanese, for example, are not nearly as inclined now to look to the Chinese communists for trade. Certainly the possibilities of the Chinese communists being seated in the UN, and I do not want to talk right now about whether the Chinese communists should be seated or not seated, but certainly the possibilities of the Chinese communists being seated this year are highly unlikely, and largely, I think, because of the great proletarian cultural revolution. You find the Chinese communists suffering a whole series of reverses in their foreign policy. The case of Indonesia is a good case, I believe. At the Tricontinental Congress in Havana, you find that the Chinese and the Russians were fighting with each other, causing a good deal of bewilderment among the communist parties in Latin America. And by the way, I would point out that the resolution that came out of that Tricontinental Congress conference was a fairly conservative resolution. If you investigate it in light of a previous resolution, you'll see that the countries staked out for guerrilla warfare number far fewer than was the case in the previous resolution. Is that the time? 2 minutes? All right. You find that Chinese efforts to suggest that Marxism-Leninism fits the Chinese case, and to adapt Marxism-Leninism to the Chinese situation might make Marxism-Leninism more palatable to some of the Chinese people, but it tends to give it such a Chinese cast that I think it becomes less palatable, not only in Western Europe, but to many of the nations in Africa and Asia. Certainly the Chinese were not terribly successful in the Congo. They were not successful at all. Secondly, when Zhou Enlai traveled through Africa last year, trying to pick up the pieces after the debacle of the abortive Solidarity Conference, the fact that he said that the Chinese communists do not believe that it's necessary to make a revolution right now, only sometime in the future, hardly allayed the fears of the nationalist leaders like Nasser and others in Africa and the Middle East. The conflict between the Soviet Union and China is also debilitating because so much of the energies and efforts of the leaders of these two countries are spent in waging this battle. mean, as the Chinese again and again have pointed out, and I'll just cite their statement of November 10th, 1965, they said that there is nothing that unifies us and much that disunites us. You find the rioting of Chinese students in Red Square. You find the Chinese trying to push the Soviets into breaking off diplomatic relationships last month by harassment of the Soviet embassy. So much of their energies are taken up with this internal struggle that you find in the case of the Soviet Union, that there's much less concern, I think, with expanding the Soviet power in the world. There are other factors also. Still another point to be made is that in the case of Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union now certainly does not have control over the Eastern European countries, such as it had in Stalin's days. These European countries, while certainly still under the shadow of Russian military might, and there are many other factors which link these Eastern European countries with the Soviet Union, nevertheless, they've shown an amazing degree of autonomy and flexibility in dealing with the Western European countries. And some of this flexibility, I would suggest, the Soviets are not very happy about. This is not simply a sinister Soviet plot to engage the Western European powers and the United States in a trade relationship which will eventually undermine the West and Western Europe. This is also an opening for the United States and Western Europe to build some bridges into Eastern Europe, and gradually, one hopes, to neutralize or at least cut out this cancer of the divided Germany in West and East Europe. Since the gong is rung, I guess I'll give up.
Okay, and now, after those opening statements, we'll have 8 minutes of response from each. Dr. Schwarz?
Well, this is one of the most cooperative debates I've ever had. I thank Dr. Swearek very much for establishing my case. I couldn't agree with him more that what's taking place in China has diminished the Chinese communist threat. And you established that very well indeed. However, there's another side to that. It causes us to focus on what is taking place in China and diverts us from what I consider as the significant communist threat, that which is posed by the Soviet Union, and the very diminution of the Chinese communist threat may serve the Soviet Union's program, which is a much more subtle and sophisticated one. But there's one statement, Dr. Swearek, with which I can't let you get away without at least a voice of protest. I'm glad you read my book, but I do wish you'd get my statements in their chronological order. I was not referring to the conflicts within the Communist Party of Russia following the death of Stalin. I was referring to the conflicts that took place in the period of the Great Purges, from 1936 to 1938. And I would suggest that these purges unified the world communist movement rather than dividing it. Now, let's look at what took place during this time. In 1936, Khrushchev tells us in his speech on Stalin, the Central Committee that elected Stalin to power consisted of 139 members and alternates. Stalin had 98 of them arrested and shot for treason. So he arrested and executed 98 of the Central Committee that elected him to power. He executed a majority of the Politburo on the death of Lenin. He executed a majority of the marshals of the Red Army. He executed a majority of the top business managers and business executives throughout the country. Now, my question is this: what happened? Did the world communist movement at that time fragment, divide into warring fragments? Or was it during this period, as you yourself said, manifesting a monolithic unity which has ceased to be since communism became more benign? And I think it's a manifestation of the old Marxian adage, a party grows strong through purging itself. And when we look at the record, Russia may have been weakened, but the Communist Party of Russia was not weakened in its unity and strength. And as far as we know, apart from speculation, Stalin stayed in a position of absolute, total power till the day of his death. So I hope we'll get that statement in its correct period in history and we'll look at it in the light of the evidence. Secondly, the question has been raised, and here's the fundamental question, and frankly I may be wrong. The problem confronting every rational student of communism is the balance between communist ideology and national sentiment. Now obviously there's a balance somewhere, and this is a quantitative point. People like to have things very simply in terms of things they can understand. They interpret it all in terms of nationalism and power plays because they're familiar with these things. It's very difficult for an individual who does not believe to understand and interpret the motives and the actions of a strong believer. And I would suggest that what is taking place in China today can no more be interpreted in terms of Chinese nationalism than the massacre of the Jews could be interpreted in terms of German nationalism. The massacre of the Jews in Germany was the result of Hitler's sincere delusions concerning the Jews, that they cursed mankind. Very difficult to establish that Germany got any national advantage out of doing this, but it was the consequence of his beliefs. Now some people think I'm a fanatic, but if I am, it's because I would rather overemphasize the power of belief than attribute it to these many other social and economic causes which undoubtedly influence what is taking place. Now, I believe I know what's taking place in communist China. I haven't been there, but I believe I know because Mao Zedong keeps me informed every week. He sends me an email letter every week to tell me precisely what is taking place. He calls it the Peking Review, which is the Mao Zedong interpretation of what is taking place in communist China. And it's impossible to work it out in terms of Chinese nationalism, but it is lucidly plain in terms of Mao Zedong's ideology. Now, what's taking place in communist China, according to what they tell us, is this. There is in being a crash program to regenerate human nature and eliminate self-interest from human nature during the lifetime of Mao Zedong. And he is so dedicated to this Marxist objective of a purified, regenerate character that he is literally smashing consistently the Communist Party of China. So what we are seeing in Communist China today is the systematic destruction of the Chinese Communist Party by the founder of Chinese communism, Mao Zedong, in the interests of pure, I wouldn't even call it Marxism-Leninism. It's got beyond that. It's now Maoist doctrine. But what he's doing, the only analogy I can give is this. Let's assume that the Pope thought that the bureaucracy of the Catholic Church had got beyond his control, and the objectives of the Church were not being achieved. Therefore, he called together the College of Cardinals, got a majority vote, purged those who were not completely subjected to him, and then proceeded to dismiss every priest, every nun, every official Catholic worker throughout the world. And in every parish he established a group of fanatical laymen subject to him and him alone to apply their program. Now that's the only way I can give an analogy of what is taking place in China today. And I suggest it's incredibly difficult to work this out in terms of the national self-interests of China. It can be worked out, and worked out very clearly, in terms of the fanatical ideology of Mao Zedong and his devotion to the announced objective of purging and purifying human nature. And I would suggest, Professor Swearek, that your argument that the Chinese communist threat has diminished, as undoubtedly it has, when we see the overthrow of communism in Indonesia, we see the debacle, so that the Chinese Communist Party today has only two allies in the Communist Party of the world, New Zealand and Albania. But I would say the other side of the coin is a potential increase in the danger of the Soviet policy for our encirclement and ultimate surrender.
Dr. Swearek?
Yes, I think you've put the issue quite squarely, because indeed I do disagree with you that communism is simply a matter of belief and philosophy. I would not want to use the term fanatic, as you did, but I do think there is a danger in assuming that it's simply a matter of belief, and that these people are operating on an operational code which has been instilled in them from early childhood. Now, to explain the dissension and the divisions which are going on in China today, I think indeed Mao Zedong, can you hear in the back? Mao Zedong, are these on?
Yeah.
Mao Zedong is indeed concerned because what he reads as the thermidor of the revolution, although he does not use that term. But I think it can also be explained in several other factors. One is Mao's personal interest. Mao has been challenged since 1963, and even earlier, by a number of the leading cadres in the Communist Party in China. Quite obviously, there was a purge in 1959, and there have been increasing signs of dissent, in fact, even published dissent by allegory and so on, but it's been dissent of Mao's policies. He was criticized for the debacle of the Great Leap Forward. He was criticized for the debacle of Let 100 Flowers Bloom, and now he's reaping the dividends of this. So that you have, in part, a personal power struggle going on between Mao Zedong on one side and Lin Biao, and on the other side Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and others. So this is a typical phenomenon that one finds in the communist world. Now, indeed, if these men are true believers, have the same outlook on the world, and therefore would assume the same policies, how can you have this kind of fighting and splitting if it's not personal power interests? The same thing, the same analogy goes with the conflicts between the Soviets and the Russians. If you have more than one pope, as you do in the communist world today, it's very difficult to remain ideologically pure. And Mao Zedong certainly sets himself up as a pope, and I'm not sure anybody in the Soviet Union today sets himself up as a pope. Now, as far as the quotation that I read from your book, indeed you were referring to the 1930s, but as I recall, either at that particular selection, and I'm sorry I didn't bring the book, or later on, you also talked about... Good. He's coming. You also talked about the purges after Stalin's death. Now, let me say these purges in the 1930s, I do not think that they unified the Soviet Union in the 1930s. I think it weakened the Soviet Union.
The Communist Party.
It weakened the Communist Party also. And what did unify the Soviet Union was the war against Germany. As you may recall, as you I think also point out in your book, when the Germans marched into the Ukraine, many Russians and Ukrainians, including Communist Party members, welcomed the Germans. But it was the fight against the Germans which unified the Russian people and the Ukrainian people also. Moreover, I'd point out, and I think you're absolutely wrong in your book, that it's simply a matter of the party, the great organizational strength of the party. Indeed, it was Stalin that assumed unassailable power in the 1930s, but Stalin almost destroyed the party to do it. And until the time of his death in 1953, Stalin's power rested on the fact that he had split the party, and he had played the party off against the police and the police off against the military. And one of Khrushchev's first moves when he was building up his own personal power was again to re-strengthen the power of the party. You simply cannot talk about an organizational structure divorced from personalities. Somewhere in your book you also mention that Stalin was you cannot talk about Stalin as the individual, but Stalin was the creation of communism. If by that you mean that the organizational structure in the Soviet Union permitted Stalin to achieve power as he did, then I would agree. If you mean, however, that it was just Stalin fulfilling some sort of role, a deus ex machina for the party, then I could not disagree more. Stalin did put his own personal stamp on the Soviet Union. 2 minutes, fine. Now, let me say a word about the Vietnam War and the Soviet military aid. There's no doubt that you're correct, that 75% of the military aid in Vietnam is Soviet military aid. However, I would suggest that the Soviets are quite embarrassed by that war in Vietnam and would prefer not to have that war in Vietnam. It's not in their own direct national interest. If the North Vietnamese win out, it's going to redound more to the benefit of the Chinese than to the Soviets. I'd also point out that the Soviets have been very careful in putting in the types of military equipment they've been putting into Vietnam. The Soviets certainly find themselves in a position, trying to look at it through their eyes, that they have to give support to the North Vietnamese. And by the way, I, with some reservation, support a good deal of our action in Vietnam. Yeah. But the Soviets certainly look at our actions there as being illegal, as being imperialistic. And secondly, if the Soviets want to retain any credibility with communist parties in Asia and elsewhere in the world, they simply have to give support to the North Vietnamese. But I would suggest that both the United States and the Soviet Union have been very cautious in escalating this war. There undoubtedly have been Soviet troops killed in North Vietnam. They've been manning those anti-aircraft missiles, and you've not heard any complaints on the part of the Soviets because of this. So that I would say that while the Soviets find themselves in the position which I think they would prefer not to be in, much as I think most Americans would prefer not to be in Vietnam also, they find that they have to give some support to the North Vietnamese, but they are doing it in a very cautious manner indeed.
And now we'll have about 4 minutes from each speaker for a concluding statement. We'll take questions and answers after those statements.
I find that there is considerably more agreement than is acknowledged. I agree, Professor Swearek, that the purges of 1936-37 weakened the Soviet Union. I claim that to all observable evidence, they strengthened the Communist Party, because the Communist Party became a monolithic unity and remained as such until the time of Stalin's death. And I differentiate very much between the Communist Party and the Soviet Union, because the Communist Party is a small fragment, considering itself an elite fragment, that monopolizes political, economic, and police power and completely controls the rest. And nowhere in the world, once communism has been established, has it ever been able to grant a free expression of opinion so that the people have a choice. For example, take Yugoslavia. I hear today that Mikolov, who wrote Summer Holiday in Russia, is in court again for the crime of trying to provide an alternative to the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, so that the people of Yugoslavia could have an alternative for which to vote. Now here Yugoslavia is supposed to be the most benign communist group in the world, but the very suggestion of permitting an alternative has become a crime which is punishable by imprisonment in jail. And we need to differentiate very carefully between the Communist Party and the people over whom it rules. Nowhere in the world has communism established its power by the expressed will and choice of the people. It invariably comes to power by deception. It remains in power by force. It is sustained in this by its own moral conviction that it is the agent and the instrument of history for this purpose. And while I would agree that there are many diverging groups of communists in the world today, we have a doctrine in capitalism that competition improves efficiency. And in many ways, this very competition may increase the communist danger. And every communist party in the world has professed to be Marxist-Leninist. The idea that you can't have quarrels between true believers is a remarkable one. I've been in many churches. The more passionate their conviction, the more bitter their quarrels. You get a quarrel between true believers over the most minute point, and it becomes almost a life and death matter. And the quarrel between Stalin and Trotsky was bitter to the point of mutual extermination, but both professed total dedication and allegiance to the doctrines of Marxism-Leninism. I would acknowledge that I now have grave doubts whether Mao Zedong in China is Marxist-Leninist, and I think this is the most remarkable development in communist history. Mao's present great cultural revolution is a program to change human nature by a non-Marxist method. His destruction of the Communist Party is anti-Leninist. His destruction of self-interest during the period of socialism is anti-Stalinist. So we have a new form in China today, which is Maoism, which I think you could get a good argument, and the Russian communists have it, that it has ceased to be Marxism, Leninism, and communism. But I would suggest that at our peril we ignore the communist ideology And just as the study of any diverse disease rests upon a sound study of pathology, an understanding of the ideology of Marxism-Leninism is basic to any effective program to preserve freedom.
I would in no way suggest that the student of the Soviet Union or China should not read Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, just as a student of American government should certainly read the writings of Jefferson, Lincoln, and the other founding fathers. And certainly the influence of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism has been more substantial than the influence of the founding fathers in the United States, and the writings are more important. But if you are looking to the ideology to give you an explanation for the actions of the leaders of these countries, I think you're going to be sadly misled. There was a good book written a number of years ago by Nathan Leitis, who's now at the Rand Corporation, called The Operational Code of the Politburo. The man very carefully went through the classics of Marxism, Leninism, pulling out what he felt were the ingredients of the operational code. If you look at that book carefully, you'll find that he says on one page that the communists are always aggressive, that they will always push as hard as they can. Later on, you'll find that he says, well, the communists, if they think they're up against overwhelming force, will always retreat at the right time. Now, I would submit to you that it would be very difficult to tell in any particular situation when the communists believe they're up against overwhelming force, because that's a subjective judgment also, and when they're not up against an overwhelming force. Secondly, when you come to the case of Western Europe, and I'd like to, perhaps this is not quite crooked, but I read one of your recent newsletters, and you suggest that one of the major threats of communism is now in Western Europe, and you say that the communist strategy is to wean away the Western European powers from the United States. And I agree that there is an element of truth here, but again, it's the way you put it. Because certainly it's not simply the communist activities. I mean, one cannot discount the actions of the United States government and our attitude towards NATO. You cannot discount the actions of General de Gaulle, and certainly General de Gaulle would not qualify to be either a communist, fellow traveler, sympathizer, pseudo-liberal, or dupe. That you have to take a look at the dynamics in Western Europe, the growth of Western European nationalism, a certain amount of jealousy of the United States, and fumbling of American policy here and there. So I think the main point that I want to end on is that you simply cannot take a narrow gauge, what I would call simplistic view of the nature of the communist world, and then prescribe recipes or nostrums on the basis of that very narrow-gauged view, which ultimately relies upon Marxism-Leninism ideology. Moreover, I would say that I think in the last 10 years, the United States and the West has done quite well in the struggle with the Soviet Union and with China, and that the wave of history may very well be on our side and not on their side.
I'm sure that many of you have questions. What I'd like you to do is this. Please direct your question to which gentleman you would like to speak first. He will speak for as long as he feels he has qualified for the answer, and then our other speaker will have a chance to reply. Yes, sir. Please, very loudly.
Strategy to encircle the United States? Well, it's interesting because, as I recall, and again, I want Dr. Schwarz to rebut this, or to answer it, if not rebut it. I hope he answers it and doesn't rebut it. But it was my impression that in the 1960-61 period, when the Crusade was really quite active in this area, the great stress was placed upon the internal communist threat, much more so than on the external communist threat. Indeed, I believe, I've read somewhere, and again, you may want to correct this, that predictions were made by Dr. Schwarz and others that the United States would fall to communism by 1973 or 75, something like this. But this was I read and did not hear directly. Now, more recently, Dr. Schwarz and the Crusade has put greater emphasis upon the external threat. Indeed, they've had some programs abroad in Thailand and British Guiana, Laos, and other places, which he can tell you about, by and large educational programs. Moreover, it was my impression in the early 60s that Dr. Schwarz put great stress upon the danger of pseudo-liberals, as he called them, many of these people frequenting the habitats of universities in the United States, who are... That's not really quite fair, and I apologize for that statement. But I do believe that it came out and that the main threat internally was indeed these pseudo-liberals who created an atmosphere behind which the communists could operate. Now the stress has been put more on the external world, I think perhaps because the viability of the democratic institutions in the United States have shown more strength than was originally projected. Now, as far as the encirclement by the communists go, I think that the thrust of the Soviet Russians has been diminished somewhat. I believe that they're much more internal looking. I do believe if they found a power vacuum, that they would indeed move into it. I do think that they are fooling around in Latin America, although I think in a very cautious way, because I would suspect they would not want to get into another Cuba situation. Cuba is fairly easy to finance. How in the world would you ever finance a Brazil or an Argentina? And indeed, I think if you read very carefully their statements at that Tricontinental Conference, you'll see that they are exercising a certain amount of caution on a number of the Latin American communist parties. It's interesting in Chile, for example, that the Communist Party is really a fairly conservative party compared to the left-wing socialists. So that I would say while certainly there is some danger of external encirclement, I do not think that it's something that's going to be facing us immediately.
Now, this is a wonderful object lesson. Obviously, Professor Swearek is a humane, informed, and highly intelligent individual, and yet it's incredible that he should be so utterly ignorant about the history and emphasis of the Christian anti-communism crusade and be subject to the great almost climatic delusions that swept this country after 1961. Now, the Christian anti-communism crusade began in 1953, and from our inception, our emphasis was mostly on the external communist threat and the totality of the communist threat, in the sense that, particularly at that time, the internal Communist Party was simply the agent of the external communist force. For example, in 1956, which is long before 1961, we invested half our income in India. Now, India is not within the United States. We helped a graduate of the University of Washington establish a daily newspaper and fought the communists in Kerala, India. And if you paid attention not simply to what you saw on TV during that week, which was abnormal and extreme, but if you took possibly the 1,000 speeches I've made, you would find that 99% of them were directed to the external threat, and the amount of time given to the internal as an end in itself was insignificant. However, when you illustrate one point, if there's an area of great sensitivity, a caress becomes an assault. And at one point, at one time, I mentioned the role of pseudo-liberals in this total position. Well, to somebody who gets sensitive on this point, it becomes a cloud that covers the whole sky and apparently our central message. So I don't know whether I'm rebutting it or not, Professor Swearek, but if you've got the time, and I see you read very well in the book, I'll give you the newsletters of the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade since 1953, and you can find out where our major emphasis has been.
Yes, sir.
No doubt we of a, quote, freedom-loving heritage must despise to any extent any anti-individualistic totalitarianistic system, which may, of course, threat the individual's own rights. Now, what I would like to ask you is, of course, the systems in Red China and Russia, of course, are quite obvious to most of us that they are these systems which threaten our rights. But what is particularly concerns me is some that aren't that obvious. Seems to me that the name of your particular organization, that is the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, somewhat eliminates the ideal of non-sectarianism that we've had in this country, which, of course, at least theoretically, is our dynamic ideal. And I'd like you to somehow explain this paradox to me, which has always been sort of perplexing, where, let's say, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, and, of course, atheists and deists would be included among your chosen people.
I'm delighted because I'm always amazed at the ignorance of the basic principles of freedom and democracy that prevail in allegedly intelligent and educated circles, and how it is conceivable that an individual could object to diversity in a free society is beyond my comprehension. The manifestation of freedom is choice. And where you eliminate choice, you eliminate freedom. Where you have a spectrum of organizations in the same field, you have choice. So diversity is the characteristic of freedom, not totalitarianism. Uniformity is the characteristic of totalitarianism. And I suggest you've got the totalitarian approach, even though you're unaware of it. Because we have this diverse approach. Now, if the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade was the entire answer to communism, if we were the one organization sweeping the field, then maybe you'd have a point. But since in a free society which allows choice and diversity of organization, in the field of education, the battle against ignorance, we have Christian universities, we have Jewish universities, we have Catholic and Protestant universities, we have atheistic universities, we have secular groups. The variety of organization is the genius of freedom, and because I'm not a fascist, because I'm dedicated to the free process, I'm proud that we're the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade and not the universal Anti-Communism Crusade.
Could I ask a question? Would you include within that diversity of organizations that operates in a free society and where there is competition among these various organizations, the Communist Party in the United States?
No, I would not, because I believe in the rule of law. I'm not an anarchist. And I believe that whatever the law has decided and determined should apply to the Communist Party. And to the extent that the law grants it, yes, I'd agree. But I believe we live in a rule of law and not in anarchy. I'm not one of these anarchists. Because when I was reminded of that when I got on the plane the other day. I hate an anarchist government that didn't even demand that the pilot had any experience flying the plane. I'm glad we've got some government. And so I say that the law should be obeyed, and whatever the democratic legislative process determines, it has my support, and when you've got the framework and you want to change, go ahead and change it.
Well, now laws are made by legislatures, and laws are made by legislatures when people put pressure on legislatures or they express their desires. Now, how would you stand vis-a-vis the legislature or the Congress of the United States in various laws, Smith Act and others, regarding the Communist Party?
Well, I stand nowhere because I've been I've been accused during this program of giving prescriptions on simplistic nostrums. Now, nothing is further from the truth. The great accusation against me is that I give no solutions, that I give no programs, that I refuse to give solutions. When people say, what should the government do, I always quote the poem in Punch. If I were dictator of England, I'll tell you what I would do. I'd sell you the job for 15 bob and throw in the hat stand too. We're pathologists who are we're reporting on communist ideology. Now, we hold certain anti-communism schools, and one of our principles is that no programs are formulated to advise the American government what to do. And so, whether communists are legal, I'm willing to debate them. I debated Otis Archer Hood at Harvard. I've debated many times. But what I say is, in a free society, keep the law.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Schwarz, you mentioned earlier, or you just mentioned, your belief in the democratic process and the legislative process. And you mentioned earlier the fact that through election, the communists have gained a great deal of power or a great deal of many seats in places like Italy. What would your reaction be to a democratic election of communists or socialists in a Western European country? How could you solve a problem like that when the people
There are a million problems in the world I can't solve. I haven't got solutions to most problems. What I would try and do, and this is all I try and do, I'd carry on an educational program to expose what I believe are the errors of communist ideology to the maximum of my ability, and hope that you and other intelligent people would be able to devise appropriate programs. I have no universal solutions. I'm not a quack.
Dr. Schwarz, did you come in? Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Schwarz, did you ever directly answer a question?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Swearek, let us pose the hypothetical situation. The Soviet Union would have followed the course that it apparently has in the past 10 years or so, which is of an apparent mellowing and satisfaction of national interest, less likely to fomenting revolution, and that the international communist movement had in fact been controlled from Moscow, it had in fact remained monolithic. Wouldn't we be better off than we are now with a polycentric communist movement, a good part of which follows the more violent, militant line?
Well, you see, I just can't visualize that of ever happening, so I don't see any point in taking the hypothetical case, because I think part of the mellowing that's gone on in the Soviet Union has been an integral part of de-Stalinization and the polycentric movement within the world communist movement. And you simply cannot separate these. One of the reasons why I think the Soviet Union is not quite so aggressive, or not nearly as aggressive in a number of the underdeveloped areas, and I agree that they're playing around in some of these areas, is simply because they know that they do not have the absolute allegiance of a number of these parties. And when you have communist parties within a country, let's take India, for example, when you have now a formal split between the Indian communists, it's much more difficult for the Russian communists to give them an order to do something. In fact, the communists in many of these countries are now in a position where they can play the Russians off against the Chinese, which is a rather enviable position from their point of view. Castro did this for a number of years, and the Indian communists are doing it right now. I would say this all would lead to more realism in the conduct of foreign policy, to a dilution of ideological motivations in foreign policy, and third, to an overall sort of weakening of the major communist thrust.
Can I just remark, in reference to India, this is just interesting, that in the one state where the communists triumphed in the recent election in Kerala, the Indian Communist Party affiliated with the Russian Communists and the Indian Communist Party affiliated with the Chinese Communists reached an electoral agreement. Apparently their split was not so profound, and on the basis of this they just swept the board. And I think that we've got to remember that as long as they're basic Marxist-Leninists, there's always the possibility of their getting together for a specific purpose.
Yeah, but I would suggest, let me answer that, that was not true of electoral alliances all over India. The communists had controlled Kerala before, and then they had lost it to the Congress Party. Here was a chance that they could really win, given the disillusion and the general demoralization of the Congress Party. So it was quite natural for power, political reasons, for the communists to get together against the Congress Party. In other parts of India, where it was not so clear that they could win, they did not get together. In fact, the Moscow-oriented Communist Party tended, by and large, to support the Congress. Peking-oriented communist parties, of course, were trying to make alliances with the socialists and others.
Your argument, then, is that ideology supersedes national interest there, is it?
No, my argument is simply that good electoral strategy supersedes ideology.
No, they did good electoral strategy in one place and not in the other places. You were saying that the good electoral strategy was the exception rather than the rule.
No, because they could not win in some of these other states where the Congress Party was strong. There was no motivation for them to get together.
Yes, sir.
No, because... No. May I explain? See, I'm a medical man, I'm a doctor, and if a person specializes in tuberculosis, I don't think he has an equal responsibility if he's writing a book to outline the evils of cancer, broken bones, ingrown toenails, urticaria, and I believe in a field of specialization, and we're specializing in this field. Now, I don't criticize people who are specializing in other fields. I don't criticize Mr. Nader, for example, who's specializing in getting safer automobiles, for not pointing out the dangers of communism. I believe in specialization. I think it is the genius of progress.
We'll have time for a couple more questions. I'd prefer these to be directed to topics that were raised during the debate. Yes, sir.
Now, Dr. Swearek may have some information about this Congress which I do not have. My information is derived from the reading of the communist periodicals, which I try to read very faithfully. At this conference, the Russian communists dominated and the Chinese communists were almost annihilated from the ideological emphasis during the conference. Now, I was surprised to hear him say that the resolution was mild, but from that conference there has been a stepped up guerrilla activity, and I'm rather surprised at this term playing round, which seems to be a typical British understatement. Playing round in Guatemala, in Colombia, in Venezuela, and there has been an increased stepped up program, and the objective is of course to get several Vietnams in Latin America, and I think this is a very real danger that nobody can overlook.
Now, can I respond to that for just a moment? I did not say it was mild. I said it was milder than than the resolution of a previous Congress 2 years before, a similar Congress, although without as many delegates. Secondly, playing around means many things. We won't go into some of the meanings of playing around. But the reason I use the term playing around is that I wanted to indicate that I think there is a difference between the Russian and the Chinese position on guerrilla warfare. The Russians indeed will support guerrilla warfare in a select number of countries. But the very fact that the Russians dominated that conference and the Chinese wanted to get involved in that conference in a big way was the Russians were taking a milder stand, a more conservative stand vis-a-vis guerrilla warfare, and the Chinese were pushing the guerrilla warfare stance. Now, if the Russians defeated the Chinese, then obviously their position won out. Thirdly, Castro himself was in a dilemma. I think he favored the Chinese position. He was for more support of guerrilla activity in Latin America. At the same time, however, Castro realized that he needs the economic support of the Soviet Union, and he simply could not sell out the Russians at that particular conference.
Well, one final question. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, Dr. Schwarz, I didn't read your book, but given the statements that Dr. Swearek made as being correct, those of which you predicted a certain communist takeover in the 7th decade of the century, in light of the present situation and conflicts among the communist world, have you revised your doomsday date?
First of all, I cannot give you that the statement was correct. I'll give you what the actual statement was, and I expect people at a university to be able to understand the difference. The statement was that there was some evidence that Stalin and Mao Zedong at their last conference in 1953 envisaged the ultimate surrender of the United States by about the year 1973. Now, that was the statement, not that I said it, but there was some evidence which came out from Chinese nationalist sources and was read into the Congressional Record by then Senator Noland, that Stalin and Mao Zedong envisaged this about 4 more 5-year plans for the consummation of world conquest. So it was never my statement. It was, I think you might agree with that. Now, secondly, with regard to the external world, I'm infinitely more optimistic than I was 10 years ago. As I look back on what's happened in the last 10 years, there was nothing comparable to it in the previous 30 or 40 years. The overthrow of the Communist Party of Indonesia, the overthrow of the communist program in Ghana, the world communist movement externally has had some severe setbacks, and on that basis there are many more grounds for optimism. On the grounds of the internal moral climate of the United States, I have much graver reservations.
Dr. Swearek, would you like to comment?
Yes, the date 1973-75 did not come out of the book. It came out of an article in the Reporter, as I recall.
Boy,
and,
what
Houghton, I believe, wrote the piece in the Reporter in 1961. And I tried to make that very clear when I made the statement.
Yeah, I know, right. But I'm saying, but these articles that, for example, I got the book Danger in the Right by the Anti-Defamation League, foster 31 provable falsehoods in the one chapter. 31. But educated people read this, and so they form certain conclusions. And I'm always looking for somebody who will investigate and do a bit of deep research.
Dr. Swearek?
Yes, just a final word. I'm concerned with how one looks at the communist world and communist menace, if you wish to use those terms, because I think the way one views the communist threat determines largely your reaction. And I think one must realize that, at least in my opinion, the Soviets and the Chinese and the others are not simply ideologically motivated. They do not adhere to a program which is unchanging. And their actions in the world and their attitude towards the world is to some extent a reflection of our actions and our attitudes and the interaction. You have a dynamic going on here. If you misread, and I think you have to constantly reevaluate what motivates the various communists, if you misread and devise a program which is wrong, you may either harden their attitudes, confirm their suspicions, or you may mislead them. And I think this is a very delicate and dangerous operation which American policymakers are involved in. Let me give you two examples. There are times, certainly I think in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the United States was right to be tough and not back down. At the same time, I think, for example, in the case of the mellowing relations with some of the Eastern European countries, although a number of members of Congress are opposed to this, that I think these kinds of trade arrangements are probably good, and that they, in the long run, one hopes will give the Eastern European regimes a greater degree of flexibility, and it may change also gradually the attitude of some of these regimes towards the United States and the West. I'll give you still another example. In the case of the defection of Stalin's daughter, there has been a big hue and cry, on part some people in the United States, that we did not allow her in the United States immediately. I think that the administration did exactly right. I'm sure Stalin's daughter will eventually get to the United States, but there was no sense in taking a chance on exacerbating relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union by bringing her here immediately, particularly because if she'd been brought here immediately, there undoubtedly would have been a large publicity campaign. She would have probably testified before congressional committees. There would have been a number of articles. They simply could not have protected her from this. We are getting, I'm sure, have most of the good information that she has to give us on the Soviet Union. Indeed, as a student of the Soviet Union, it would be fascinating to have her accounts of what happened after Stalin's death and before Stalin's death. But I think it was very wise of our government not to bring her here at this time. And then one last final example, in the case of our current policy towards China, I think the mere fact that Chiang Kai-shek has not been unleashed against the communist mainland, as the Chinese communists for so long were concerned that he would be, perhaps will, in the long run, begin to change their opinions of the United States.
I'd just like to say that...
Can I have that same amount of time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say this. With regard to these practical governmental policies, I pray you have me excused. I don't know. It's very difficult to adjudicate the results, but I say we're gambling for high stakes, and it is a gamble we should not take to believe that the communists have renounced their doctrines and objectives, as we sometimes tend to do. And we should view Marxism-Leninism from the point of view of the science which it itself claims to be, a science in the sense that it takes existing forces and transforms them into its servants. For example, a sailor can take a wind and make it drive a boat against itself. The communists take the desire to own private property and conquer Russia and China with it. This doesn't mean that they've renounced communism or communist objectives, but they conquered both Russia and China through the advocacy of private ownership of land, the creation of little capitalists. And what is imperative is that we study thoroughly the philosophy and morality of communism so as to interpret their actions. Otherwise, we can be deceived. And along with everything that Dr. Swearek suggests, I would continue to advocate a profound attention to the doctrines, the history, the philosophy, and the theories of Marxism-Leninism.
Regardless of, or maybe in spite of, our original debate topic, I think that the discussion here motivated to a very meaningful question which all of us will have to decide in how our country and ourselves relate to the outside world, particularly the communist world, in quotes, whether it will be a pragmatic or an idealistic approach. On behalf of those of us here, those who were here in the university, thank you both very much.